OK，好的，今天欢迎大家来到华视，然后参加早上的会议。Welcome to ECNU. Welcome to Department of Politics, professors, guests, and students. So I'm the chair of this morning's meeting. So I'm Jiang Yuhui, from Department of Politics. I'm colleague of Professor Wu Guanjun. Okay, so this morning's first speaker will be Jason Moore. I'll give a short introduction. Sorry. Jason Moore is a professor from Binghamton University, and he will give a lecture on man, nature, and other ruling abstractions. Why Marx's method matters for the class struggle in the web of life. So we're looking forward to a wonderful talk from Jason Moore. Okay, so you may begin. You have 40
Perfect. Yes.
40 minutes. For
Perfect. I will not take that long. Well, let's begin with man, nature, civilization. These ruling abstractions forged across the centuries by the 1% have held hostage our planetary imaginary for far too long. These are not only the most dangerous words in the English ideological language, they are organizing principles of modern thought, power, and profit. They are fundamental to the accelerating planetary crisis. Insofar as we take the bourgeois environmental imaginary at face value, man versus nature as the eternal conflict, hopelessness always follows. Capitalist power drops from the frame. We are all doomed, we are told. And in this light, the popular Anthropocene becomes the environmentalist version of neoliberal dogma. There is no alternative. Among contemporary Marxism's greatest concessions to bourgeois materialism is the claim that the history of class society, ridden history, as Engels called it in a footnote to the manifesto, that this history of class society is a derivation of man and nature. Not so for Marx and Engels. From Marx onwards, communists correctly identified arguments premised on man against nature as counter-revolutionary, because they were counter-revolutionary. From Thomas Malthus to Galton to Hardin and Paul Ehrlich to today's popular Anthropocene. My work today is this: to underline the extraordinary cultural and ideological power of man and nature, mediated in bourgeois fashion by a technocratic or seemingly superficially technocratic civilizing project, the cultural and scientific expression of the bourgeoisie's class war across the centuries. Nature and its antonym, man, are not the only ruling ideas, not by a long shot, but they were the first. They emerged as the expression in thought of the separation of peasants from the land in the original moment of primitive accumulation. They've been rebranded and repackaged ever since. The language has changed, but the essence has remained the same. They've lost none of their grip on the imagination of the bourgeoisie, most environmentalists, and even many eco-socialists. Man and nature, the antiquated language here is deliberate, are the furthest thing from free-floating signifiers, as the post-structuralists would have it. They are ruling ideas in Marx's precise sense and real abstractions in Sohn-Redels. Man and nature are the greatest of the bourgeoisie's ruling ideas. They are the ideological software of capitalist hegemony over power, profit, and life. Their invention in the 2 centuries after 1492 is well documented, if underappreciated, and generally ignored by Marxists and other critical environmental scholars. These abstractions, man and nature, are abstractions successively and in concert that are violent, real, and ruling abstractions. The power of capitalism's ruling abstractions is such that even most Marxists do not see two pivotally decisive and entangled ideological realities unfolding under the sign of man against nature, the eternal conflict. One is that man and nature, cohered through successive concrete civilizing projects, is not about human beings distinguished from extra-human webs of life. Nature, as Claudia von Verhoeff quips, is everything the bourgeoisie does not wish to pay for. Thus, the extremely tight historical connection between bourgeois naturalism and imperial, racist, and sexist ideology and praxis, intimately bound to the class dynamics of superexploitation. The second ideological reality is even more obscure. Indeed, I can find no reference to it in the vast Marxist literature on capitalism's ecologies. Man and nature are not merely ideological claims floating in the ether. They are emergent and developing basic principles of bourgeois planetary management. Simply put, man versus nature constitute the operating premise, the software, for the imperialist bourgeoisie's structures of planetary management over war, over planetary life, and of course, over labor. Even before the Cartesian dualism of thinking and doing, Europe's empires set about organizing a planetary division of labor that was far more than core against periphery, town and country. It was a management philosophy of developing a qualitative material break between intellectual and manual labor. Son Redl's insights into the development of class society and its organization of mental and manual labor can, in this light, be joined to Harry Braverman's class struggle theory of management and his critique of the separation of conception from execution that comes about in highly mature form with Taylorism, scientific management, and during the rise of monopoly capitalism. And incidentally, scientific management emerges out of the forests, not the factories. Well, let me just sketch my understanding of Marx's method. And this will necessarily be ruthlessly and ridiculously brief. But here are 8 methodological principles. There may be others, but these are some reasonable approximation of the core of Marx and Engels' historical materialist method. I'll try to use their words or something very close to them. First, proletarian theory always unfolds on the real ground of history. Second, the proletariat can only exist world historically. Third, all modes of life are defined by labor processes that are irreducibly socio-ecological. All of these are introduced so far in the German ideology, by the way. Fourth, production is always also reproduction, the production of one's daily bread and of fresh life in procreation. Fifth, ideas and ideologies are class relations. Ruling ideas are not abstractly ideological, but implicated in class rule and the exploitation in the capitalist era, the exploitation of surplus value. Sixth, human labor is a specifically harnessed natural force, as Marx writes in the Grundrisse. The starting point for a Marxist analysis is not and never can be man against nature, but the labor process as an ensemble of social relations, as Marx underlines in the 6th thesis on Feuerbach. Labor creates within a world that is given and made, a world of dialectical and non-dialectical antagonisms in the web of life. Seventh, the crucible of Marxist theory is the real ground of history. That is to say, the concrete interpretation of turning points and patterns of class society in the web of life. In the capitalist era, that real ground is fundamentally world historical, Marx and Engels argue again and again. And finally, Marx's method differs only in form, not substance, from the praxis of the socialist forces of the worldwide class struggle from below. The philosophy of praxis demands the collective talents of the historian and the prophet. These are the 2 moments of praxis. Well, of historical capitalism's ruling ideas, as we've seen, none are more fundamental than man and nature, the signposts of bourgeois humanism and naturalism that so enraged and infuriated Marx. They are ruling abstractions, man and nature, connecting folk concepts in everyday life with the commanding premises and assumptions of the ruling classes. Their illusory separation embodies the first managerial principle, separating the thinking from the doing, from Descartes to from Descartes to Locke to Frederick Winslow Taylor and many others ever since. This is the geomanagerialism that unifies the bourgeoisie's planetary management of life, labor, and war. Ruling abstractions, none more so than nature, are especially intoxicating for intellectuals. Marx and Engels knew this well. That's why they began their formulations of historical materialism by warning the young Hegelians that ruling ideas like man and nature invite them to embrace the illusions of their epoch. We need no further illustration than the recent raft of Marx and capitalism in the Anthropocene, books, articles, and conferences. I can practically hear Marx turning over in his grave. Socialism is not about saving nature, a long-standing imperialist trope. It is, as Marx clarifies, about workers' power and the democratization of all domains of the human experience in the web of life. Ruling abstractions do more than mask capitalism's bloody realities. They communicate and enable the prevailing common sense of these ruling ideas. As we know, the circuit of capital sweats ruling abstractions from every pore. They entwine specific forms of domination and surplus extraction in class societies. Race, gender, and nation, all derivations of naturalism, are good examples. Crucially, the critique of ruling abstractions joins the material, economic, and ideological domains within a dialectical frame. Because capitalist polarization is indeed unprecedented compared to all other class societies, this is Marx's general law of accumulation, in which the accumulation of capital and the accumulation of misery go hand in hand. It also produces an unprecedented fragmentation of intellectual life. And this is crucial to the managerial imperatives of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. This is the underlying material class condition for ontological dualism, man against nature, to be mediated by the rationality and the enlightened civilizing practices of the conquerors. Well, Marxists learned very early that capital accumulation runs on commodity fetishism. Marx's readers know that commodity fetishism was fundamental to his critique of classical political economists like David Ricardo and Adam Smith. Marx argued that a peculiar transformation occurs under capitalism. Instead of viewing production as a social relation, commodity fetishism, quote, conceals the social character of private labor and the social relations between the individual workers, unquote. It makes, again quoting, those relations appear as relations between material objects. So far, so good. We all know this. Less obvious is this world historical transition. Commodity fetishism historically emerged from and depended upon an earlier and spectacular geocultural shift towards civilizational fetishism. Like commodity fetishism, civilizational fetishism was and remains deeply practical. Both fetishisms work in spite of their mystifications, not in spite, pardon me, both fetishisms work not in spite of their mystifications, but because of them. Capitalist fetishization is a very strange thing, Marx writes, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. It's extraordinary how socialists have accepted the critique of commodity fetishism, but been unable to pierce the veil of imperial naturalism, imperial humanism, and the civilizational fetishism that mediates those fetishes. At its core, civilizational fetishism evacuates the relations of power, including their socio-natural properties, again quoting Marx, that produce and sustain the boundaries between so-called savagery and so-called civility. In this scheme, the scheme of the civilizer, man, nature, and civilization appear as independent entities. Problems appear as ecological problems rather than the contradictions of capital, class, and empire. Well, through the civilizational fetish, the categories of lived experience, of savagery and civilization are transformed from political and coercive strategies into self-evident facts. Hence the absurdity of people writing books with titles like Marx in the Anthropocene. In the hegemonic view, the relation of civilization to nature is material, not political. It is a domain to be managed by good science and enlightened rationality. The relations of power and reproduction that led every colonial power to define its new subjects as savages are erased in the process. This is what fetishism does. Man, society, and nature appear as relations between material objects. Well, here we may extend Stone-Reddle's critique of real abstraction beyond the circulation of value and the antagonisms of mental and manual labor. Civilization and savagery emerged as ruling abstractions in the rise of capitalism through financialized imperialist projects. The Iberians are a perfect example, and they were committed to planetary management and the militarized and juridical enlargement of cheap nature frontiers. Civilizational fetishism, in other words, is the historical and logical precondition for the globalization of commodity fetishism. Each new commodity frontier and every new phase of capitalism is announced with a new promise of civilization, of development, of sustainable development in time. Let's recognize that bourgeoisies are relatively powerless to establish the political conditions of a good business environment. Ruling abstractions through successive civilizing projects linked closely to the environmentalism of the rich over the centuries have been fundamental to this world history of political accumulation, sometimes reckoned as recurrent primitive accumulation. The bourgeoisie cannot accumulate surplus value without the legal and military force of empires, which established the political framework for capitalist competition on the world market. They also, as part of this drive, established the geocultural premises of such rule: man, nature, and the enlightened rule of the civilizers, who are always practicing, according to them, what Weber sarcastically called the European rationality of world domination. The world bourgeoisie cannot counteract the tendency towards a falling rate of profit without geocultures of domination and the ruling abstractions that make them possible. These suppress wages and consumption. They divide the world proletariat through sexist, racist, and nationalist abstractions. And geocultures of domination are doubly strategic. They confound confounding the man-nature binary. The super exploitation of humans is part of this, but also the rapid appropriation and thence exhaustion of webs of life necessary to sustain endless accumulation. The critique of bourgeois ideology, above all its pillars of civilizational fetishism and bourgeois naturalism, is fundamental to what I have called the world ecology conversation. This is a conversation, a political project in pursuit of the standpoint of the proletariat in the web of life. So my line of march follows the imperative to connect what is disconnected through these fetishes, to connect historical capitalism's ideological, material, ecological, and class relations. This is not a matter of abstract theorizing. It is theory, or Lenin's theoretical struggle, on Marx's real ground of history. Who and what the imperial bourgeoisie designates as nature, and who and what the bourgeoisie designates as society or civilization, is fundamental to understanding capitalism's drive to climate crisis and its capital-ogenic, that is, made by capital-ogenic trinity of the climate class divide, climate patriarchy, and climate apartheid. An eco-socialism that relegates geocultural domination to the status of a secondary contradiction rather than woven into the fabric of endless accumulation and the endless conquest of the earth is one that accepts the economic reductionism of bourgeois thought, environmentalist politics, and disarms movements for planetary socialism. The unfolding climate crisis calls for a reimagination of the standpoint of the proletariat. For Lukács, of course, the dialectical point of view of totality was not only the point of departure, the subjective moment, but also the point of return, the objective moment for Marxist investigation, interpretation, and its contribution to the struggle for socialism. Among the path-breaking contributions of ecological Marxists in recent decades has been this: the construction of totality proceeds from precisely what is fetishized under capitalism, its socio-natural properties, and the contradictions of accumulation and patterns of class struggle in the web of life. The question of method is a question of the class struggle in the web of life. When Marx in Capital observes that capitalism degrades the soil and the worker, he foregrounds the necessary conditions of capitalist development in the web of life. Capitalist class formation unfolds through the political imposition of property relations that allow for the two essential conditions, the necessary but not sufficient, but essential conditions of endless accumulation. One is cheap labor, of course, including centrally the unpaid work of humans defined as natural, for example, women. Second is cheap nature, of which labor is a part, but encompasses all webs of life put to work for capital. These moments from above imply and necessitate the emergence of proletarian class power from below. And from this standpoint, proletariat, that is, putting humans to work for capital, and biotariat, putting extra human life to work for capital, form a world historical unity. This is Marx's point about the soil and the worker that defetishizes the ruling abstractions of man against nature. This class struggle in the web of life, the unity of proletariat and biotariat, is the dialectical counter-tendency to the civilizing project and its Promethean fantasies. These projects, fantasies, and the endless accumulation of capital produce its world historical negation in the planetary proletariat. Prometheanism was the original form of bourgeois domination, simultaneously creating a dualist cosmology of civilization and savagery, the language of the times, and cultivating the bourgeois conceit that webs of life may be infinitely controlled in the interests of man's improvement. Remember the point about managerialism. This was the bourgeoisie's alienated self-interest, self-knowledge, rather, of its Promethean managerialism, emerging initially in the great plantations and mining enterprises of the Americas in the Age of Conquest. Capitalism creates its biotarian gravediggers alongside the global proletarian forces, who together produce limits that cannot be fixed through capitalist politics as usual. This is an alternative to the limits to growthism that prevails amongst eco-socialists today. This dynamic, this reading of limits involves what I've called negative value, the activation of new potentialities slumbering within nature, as Marx says in Capital. Only this time, those potentialities are not enabling capital accumulation, they are undermining the productive forces. Such negative value finds its most dramatic expression today in the relation between climate crisis and its termination of the agricultural revolution model that began 5 centuries ago. Here, biotariat and proletariat are not separate entities, but rather interpenetrating moments distinctive in late capitalism's rich totality of many determinations. From the standpoint of the planetary proletariat, capital's webs of life, capital's limits in the web of life can be grasped in relation to Marx's theory of value and the history of the real ground, the actually existing processes of capitalism, its class structures and struggles. We cannot reduce history to the logic of capital, as some eco-socialists would do, nor can we reduce it to abstract incantations of materialism, most often of the vulgar materialist variety. We must then follow Marx in rising from the abstract to the concrete, not once, not twice, but relentlessly and without cease, and thence Upon our return from the concrete to the abstract, we must rethink and reimagine anew. To paraphrase Bhaskar, dialectics is the great loosener, a journey that fails to grasp how a historical geographical totality acquires new properties through the generation of new antagonisms is undialectical and inadequate to the tasks of the planetary proletariat in the unfolding planetary inferno. The bourgeois environmentalist mantra of externalities is a mystification of the sources of unpaid work and unpaid energy that enable the expanded reproduction of capital. It conceals also the revolt of the biotarian fraction of the proletariat. Furthermore, while only valorized labor produces value directly, the total circuit of capital accumulation depends for its expanded reproduction on the extra economic appropriation of unpaid work. This is Rosa Luxemburg's classic point, and it is more relevant than ever. And of those sources of unpaid work, the principal human sources are female and feminized work. They are the femitariat alongside proletariat and biotariat, the femitariat whose revolutionary capacities derive from its situated position in the relations of exploitation and appropriation. Biotariat and femitariat must be continually renewed, which capital can only achieve through new imperialisms that create at gunpoint new frontiers. Those frontiers today are exhausted. Historically, these cheap nature frontiers have attenuated the surplus capital problem by reducing reproduction costs and creating new profitable investment opportunities. Today, those frontiers are fewer than ever, while the surplus capital seeking investment is greater than ever. An epochal crisis looms. To underline the point, this unpaid work is a class struggle over the working day, in Marxist terms again, and therefore a struggle over worldwide surplus value. Marx emphasizes the point in Capital. Quote, what interests capital is purely and simply the maximum of labor power that can be set in motion in a working day. It attains this objective by shortening the life of labor power in the same way as a greedy farmer snatches more produce from the soil by robbing it of its fertility. This class struggle over the nexus of paid and unpaid work, mediated through the bourgeois state, imperial formations, and the bourgeoisie's ruling abstractions, is at the center of climate crisis. We cannot forge a proletarian climate politics without this recognition of these fetishes and of and pierce the veil of man and nature so that we may see Marx and Engels' labor ontology, which allows us to see that the climate crisis is a class struggle. This is the world ecology conversation. It is a conversation and political project that seeks to join as differentiated unities what Engels calls the production and reproduction of real life, the endless accumulation of capital, the militarization of accumulation, and modernity's ruling abstractions. That's a lot, I recognize. I'll repeat here that historical materialism is historical, or it is nothing. At its best, historical materialism challenges intellectual business as usual, including Marxist dogma, including Marxist belief structures. Historical materialism opens our eyes and our political imaginations to the revolutionary possibilities of the diversity of life, from which, as Marx and Engels say, the writing of history must always set out, and that diversity is variously inside, outside, and in between the specific expressions of human relations, which are always relations of work. So to conclude, humans are, like all life and environment-making species, so too human organizations, from families to financial centers to empires. Life is the connective tissue of inside, outside, and in between, but life is a labor process. Life is permeated with potential, yes, for alienation, but also for liberation. Life makes human organizations, and human organizations today massively in the case of capitalism, and climate change makes webs of life. And in this perspective, the work of empires and civilizing projects of every kind is not outside, but integral to class formation and class conflicts. At every point, appropriating webs of life necessary to advancing the world rate of profit and the class relations that underpin it in the capitalist era. So too, the communist horizon, the imagination and praxis that will allow for the flourishing of a socialist project that takes webs of life not as something to be dominated, but as comrades in arms. This is Marx and Engels' cooperation as a force of production. These relations of cooperation can unleash extraordinary possibilities for liberation and the production of unprecedented abundance for the many rather than the few. The standpoint of the proletariat must be battle-tested on the crucible of actually existing world history. They must be refined and reinvented through revolutionary struggle in the planetary crisis. To paraphrase the young Marx, radical ideas become material forces when mobilized by the proletarian forces in the web of life. Here we may find in World-Ecology a certain reading of hope and praxis that will widen the possibilities for the socialist imagination of humans, for the socialist emancipation of humans and the rest of life. To borrow from Emanuel Wallerstein, ours is a moment of the worldwide class struggle in the socio-physical conjuncture. That class struggle does not merely occur in the web of life, it is a product and producer of the webs of life that will shape our planetary habitats for millennia to come. The liberation of the soil and the worker will come together or not at all. Thank you.
About maybe Marx's thoughts about human nature and about planetary politics, and also about the future of liberation of human nature. I think today we're still facing the difficulties of Anthropocene and maybe Capitalocene. So, and also your thoughts about 8 methods are very insightful. So thanks again. Okay, so maybe it's time for discussions, questions, or comments, or maybe even critic. Oh, okay. So finale.
Of course.
Yeah.
For a ruthless criticism.
Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to put a question about the materialism in Marx, because you have spoken very well about the relationship between man and nature, but I would know if there is a question also not only between man and external nature, but also between a man and its proper inner nature. I would ask if there is a question about the materialism, and if we can satisfy today about the 6th thesis on Marx, Feuerbach, that the human essence is the ensemble of social relations. Do you think that this definition can today is well enough to indicate the nature of the man, because there is also an inner nature in the man. And there is an inner society in the man. And I think that a new materialism update with the condition of the world and the class struggle today must consider also this kind of inner nature and all the problems which the inner nature pose to the human mind.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe one by one will be fine. Okay. Yeah.
Well, you have stated oh, should I wait or
No,
reply?
you
I
can
think I can be concise. The professor is absolutely correct, has stated the matter perfectly, that Marx, from the beginning, understood with extraordinary compassion and insight this connection between the internal life, whole life of the spirit, of the mind, of human creativity in its full social and socio-ecological character. And he understood this from the beginning. And so absolutely, he understood that the accumulation of capital is a torture, is a torment, that for the worker the accumulation of capital means the accumulation of misery. And this is why also in the German ideology, they insist on mental labor, on the means of mental production, on the power of ideas to reinforce class power, to make class power possible by robbing the potential of human beings, a point made, I think, masterfully in the 1844 manuscripts, of course. So whether or not socialists and Marxists have adequately brought that into consideration, I think probably not. But for the planetary, for the standpoint of the planetary proletariat, as I outline it, yes, absolutely, that we must fight and struggle against this torment, against the misery, against the alienation and fracturing and crippling of human spiritual life as part of the totality of the experience, always remembering that those ensembles are labor ensembles that come first. And then we have man. We have only historical man. We have no man in nature. We have no Anthropocene, which is a bourgeois con job, a deceitful, a fraudulent set of claims to force us to think in terms of man and nature. It's absolutely false. It's absolutely inaccurate. And we should struggle against those falsifications at every point.
I find a lot in your talk agreeable, but let me repeat because I don't know the Jeremy. I find a lot in your talk agreeable, but one term stood out in particular that I think we should think about a little bit more, and that was your pejorative description of the word civilization, which, if I understand that from a Western universalist concept, I completely concur with that pejorative description. But at the same time, is it possible that there are other civilizations or civilizational models or civilizational values that aren't necessarily things that we should aim to negate entirely? And is it possible to imagine, and this is more just a pure theoretical question, a society in which a civilizational concept doesn't exist?
Well, so my use, oh, sorry, was there more?
Nope.
Okay, perfect. I wanted to make sure I wasn't talking. It's a fantastic question. And I've written at great length on this question. My use of civilization comes out of the civilizing projects of historical capitalism that all discovered the savages in other lands who needed to be civilized. So it is a historical abstraction and not a thought abstraction. If people want to use civilization to narrate Safavid Persia or Song Dynasty China, please go ahead. The sense in which I am using it is the sense in which contemporaries in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, sometimes into the last century, used it in terms of the civilizing project, of course, manifold and uneven in all the ways we would expect historically, but as a concrete historical formation. And I've walked through elsewhere the civilizing projects and the imperial naturalism as ruling abstractions, as real productive forces of domination, but also of the exploitation of surplus value and of unpaid work in successive regimes, from the Iberians to the Dutch to the British to the Americans, and all the way up through the Washington Consensus. So I imagine people could use, I have no problem if people want to use that thought abstraction in a different way, but the precise meaning is rooted, of course, in the concrete world historical reading of civilizing projects as class projects, as histories of the ruling ideas grounded in, if you will, the real ground of history. It's a fantastic question.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasant speech, but I also have a question about the continent. And I think the challenge of economic crisis are divergent and concrete. And sure, definitely you can talk about the ruling of productive forces, but for a lot of national states, the choice between economic development and economic sustainability, you know, I think it's a great it's a great difficulty for a national state to do, because you know, I don't think actually I don't think there is I don't think there is human beings in general here, and because but they are divided into different groups of benefits. Not only the dualism of bourgeois and proletariat. And so do you think the theory of class struggle of Marx can be responsible for the difficulty of choice, or based on the class theory of class struggle, we can resolve the dilemma?
The dilemma of the climate crisis, or another dilemma? I want to make sure I understand.
I think a lot of time the difficulty of ecological challengers are not based on the dualism of bourgeois and proletariat, because it is between economic development and sustainable ecology. So governments should make up policies to do the choice, and it is not for actually I think the theory of class struggle cannot be responsible for the dilemma of choice.
Okay, well, I think one of the things that I heard, I think you're raising a series of important issues. One of the things that I have been arguing for the past decade is that the environmentalism of the rich that emerges after 1968 in the imperialist West emerges precisely in response to Third World revolt and to the socialist challenge above all. Now, it may be that we just have a different reading of recent world history, but the whole reason why climate change is the carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions are accelerating is because of the law of value and capital's drive to increase profitability, to expel labor, and to externalize all possible costs onto the rest of our bodies. And so it is all about the rate of profit. And I'll tell you, the people who believe that the most are not Marxists, but the capitalists, the masters of mankind, the planetary superclass. And we are now at a moment where they are using man and nature and sustainability language. And this is not new, but it has achieved a new form in recent years of nature positive, of planetary stewardship, of plans to, this comes out of the Imperial West, especially plans to resolve the climate crisis through austerity on the bottom 80% of the world population. Of course, as everyone knows, complicated now by the end of American unipolar hegemony. And I'll leave it there. It's a rich question, though.
Should we move on to the next lecture? 啊，好的，我找一下那个介绍。哎呀，不好意思。The next speaker will be Toscano? Yeah, Professor? Alberto Toscano from Simon Fraser University, and he will give a lecture on capitalizing on spirits, fascism, liberalism, and abstraction. So, okay, you may begin.
Okay, can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the very kind invitation, and I'd like to thank Conrad Hamilton and obviously all of the organizers and hosts and participants. So I'll just begin. Historically, where some critics have seen in fascism a passion for abstractions, others have indicated a phobia for the abstract as one of its leading traits. These perspectives are not necessarily incompatible. The Vichy collaborationist regimes, for instance, in France during World War II, substituted the revolutionary universalism of liberté, égalité, fraternité with travail, famille, patrie, freedom replaced by work, equality replaced by the family, fraternity replaced by fatherland. As the French philosopher Alain Badiou observed, I quote, "Fascisms invariably replaced the subjective universality of truth procedures, political invention, artistic creation, and so on, which they detested, with the designation of great referential collectives, the nation, the race, the West." The same abstract idea of freedom can be stripped of its subjective universality and ascribed to one of these collectives, German freedom, for instance, or stripped of any of its emancipatory content, as in freedom to obey. But to capture fascism's ambiguous relationship to abstraction, it does not suffice to explore its relationship to political abstractions. We must, perhaps above all, delve into its nature as a reaction formation to the real abstractions of capitalism under conditions of deepening and protracted crisis. While the most dogged thinker of real abstraction, about whom I believe you have heard or will hear about in this conference, namely the German Marxist philosopher Alfred Zolletel, made important empirical and theoretical contributions to the study of the nexus between fascism and capitalism. These are collected in English, for instance, in the volume Economy and Class Structure of German Fascism, and also can be found in non-English editions of his landmark book, Intellectual and Manual Labor. I would argue that the theoretical development of the articulation between fascism and real abstraction is principally to be sought elsewhere, namely in the margins of the oeuvre of Zonrétel's only true philosophical interlocutor, Theodor Adorno, and in the largely neglected theory of fascist ideology, sketched out by Norbert Gutermann and Henri Lefebvre in their 1936 book, La conscience mystifiée, Mystified Consciousness. I will briefly touch on Adorno before moving on to Gutermann and Lefebvre, to be followed by a short conclusion on the question of liberalism. In view of thinking through the threads linking the fascist problematic to the question of real abstraction, it is particularly worthy of note that the period in which Adorno's engagement with Zonrétel's ideas was most intense was also that of his own study of the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl. This culminated in the book Against Epistemology, drafted in 1934 to 37 during his English exile and originally intended for a doctorate at Oxford. This was also the time of Adorno's writings on the fetish character of music and his famous or infamous writings on jazz. In the Husserl book, Adorno drew on Zonrétel's insights to formulate his argument about the reification of logic as a self-alienation of thought. Sorry, I was just distracted by the fact that the transcript gave Adorno as McDonald's, which was quite ironic, but in any case. For Adorno, the neglect of the changing content of the objects of thought is the abstraction that serves as the presupposition of all logic. This is what Adorno argues in Against Epistemology, I quote, "Logic takes its cue from the form of commodities whose identity consists in the equivalence of exchange values. By the same token, however, it also looks to a societal relation unperceptive about itself, false consciousness, the subject. Logical absolutism," Adorno continues, "is two things. It is reflection in the subject of reification, which is performed by the subject, which itself ultimately becomes a thing. It is also the attempt to break the spell of universal subjectivization and intercept, by means of something straightforwardly irreducible, a subject which for all its power suspects itself of arbitrariness, if not impotence." It is interesting to note here that for Adorno, while taking from Zonrétel the notion of a projection of the commodity form onto the form of philosophical thought, it is in a sense always concerned, real abstraction is always concerned for Adorno with the moment of the subject's labor. This will also be true of how he reads Hegel as making it possible, via Marx, to see social labor as dispelling what he terms the mystery behind synthetic apperception, or how he will contend that in Kantian philosophy, the world, reality as a whole, is turned into a product, in fact, the product of labor, of effort, revealing, in Adorno's words, the essential antinomy of bourgeois society in general, as the twinned acceleration of subjectivism and reification. As Adorno observes in one of his lectures on Kant's critique of pure reason, because analysis shifts the entire weight of the dynamic character of reality onto the side of the subject, our world becomes increasingly the product of labor. We might say it becomes congealed labor. We might here talk of the commodity character of the world, whose rigidity and inflexibility keeps increasing thanks to this process. The matrix of this commodity analysis of Kantian philosophy bears strong analogies with the remarks on stereotypy and personification in the collective book, The Authoritarian Personality, which Adorno co-authored with a number of American psychologists in the post-war period. It also resonates with the way in which the Marxian theory of commodity fetishism is refunctioned to grasp what Adorno calls the fetish character of contemporary music and the regression of listening in his famous 1938 essay. Now, Zonrétel's own comments on Adorno's philosophical and musical work of this period in their correspondence are also of interest to our purposes. In a letter from the 8th of July, 1938, he notes his difference from Adorno's conviction that the liquidation of philosophical idealism must take place through immanent critique, whose Hegelian principle is, according to Zonrettel, genuine refutation must penetrate the power of the opponent and meet him on the ground of his strength. The case is won not by attacking him somewhere else and defeating him where he is not. Against this, Zonrettel posits that, quote, only the critique of, and this is important, only the critique of the genesis of a mental point of view constitutes a path to judge the immanence of that viewpoint and of its conceptual system. And this is what he sees developed in his own reduction of the transcendental subject to money, a reduction to money and not, unlike in Adorno's perspective, to labor. For Zonrettel, the forms of thought must be sought in commodity exchange alone, which is to exploitation and labor, while it is to exploitation and labor that one must turn to explain how philosophy, in his own words, generates the fetishism of these forms and determines their material content. In a letter of 22 April 1942, again to Adorno, Zonrettel makes this point about the distinction between the fetishism of thought and the fetishism of value by way of a critique of Marcuse's book Reason and Revolution, published in 1941. And this is what Zonrettel says. To my mind, the crucial point is this. The fetish concept of logic has a different social referent with respect to the fetish concept of value. The latter, that is to say the fetish concept of value, refers to the antagonism between capital and labor. The first, that is to say the fetish concept of logic, to the antithesis between intellectual and manual labor. The determination of the socially necessary form of intellectual labor takes on its epistemological fetish character as logic, through its combination with an eternal idea of truth. As I've tried briefly to show, or at least to suggest, the traces of the problematic of real abstraction articulated by Zonrettel from the late 1920s onwards can be discerned in Adorno's own efforts to theorize both the actuality of and the potentials for fascism. In the same period, a hitherto largely overlooked elaboration of a Marxist theory of the reality of abstraction developed out of a militant and theoretical commitment to anti-fascism, namely in Norbert Guterman and Henri Lefebvre's 1934 book, La Conscience mystifiée, the first part of what was supposed to be a multi-part volume on the theory of ideology that never materialized. Guterman and Lefebvre's project, of which mystified consciousness was to be but a first installment, was that of forging a science of ideologies in the conjuncture of rising European fascisms and of the theoretically and politically disoriented communist and socialist resistance to them. Guterman and Lefebvre contend that a materialist and proletarian destruction of capitalist fetishism must start with the embodied suspicion that, as they put it, one is being dispossessed